Here to discuss this in more detail, I'm joined by Mark Kortepeter, who is an expert in germ warfare defense. He held multiple leadership roles at the nation's largest containment laboratory dedicated to biological warfare defense. Mark, great to have you with us. How can there be this much speculation about the origin of the virus, even within the same government?
Well, I think the fundamental challenge is it's very hard to determine that something actually came out of a laboratory, especially if you can't access that laboratory. Uh, we know that coronaviruses exist in nature and that they're circulating in bat populations. So it's very likely the virus originated in nature. And what we had was what was called a spillover event. And we've seen this before with the previous SARS coronavirus, and now most likely with this virus. Where the challenge comes in is if you're trying to say something spilled out of a lab accidentally, the only way you're going to find that for sure is to be able to find a so-called smoking gun, which means you can get in the laboratory and identify specimens that were there prior to the outbreak, and then marry those up with actual human, virus that's been isolated from humans.
So, in terms of how a virus can actually, you touched on it a bit, but there are several ways that you have mentioned before about how a virus can escape a lab. Is there any particular relevance that has to these Chinese laboratories? Because there have been reports that some of them aren't up to standard.
Well, I think the first thing to think about is with a specialized containment laboratory. And when I talk about containment laboratory, I'm talking about a biosafety level 3 or 4 laboratory. And these are laboratories that work on specific agents that are known historically to cause infection of laboratorians, or they could potentially spread through the air to the laboratorians. So they require specialized handling. So the laboratories that are BSL 3 or 4 have various measures in place, such as engineering controls like negative pressure air handling, HEPA filtration. People who work in the laboratories have to be highly trained. And then, of course, most people are familiar with the personal protective equipment that's worn. Inside a BSL-3 lab, people might wear something called a positive air purifying respirator if they're at an at-risk area, or they obviously will work under a what's called a Class 2 cabinet or a hood. But they're also in the biosafety level 4 lab, they'll wear a fully encapsulated suit. We all call colloquially a spacesuit. But the bottom line is, if a place is actually following the appropriate procedures and have the appropriate engineering controls, it's very difficult to have an event where someone gets infected in the laboratory. There are different ways it can happen, but it's a fairly rare phenomenon, especially in a biosafety level 4 laboratory.
So, Mark, from what you have learned about the coronavirus itself and what you have heard from scientists as well as U.S. officials, we know that the Trump administration is going to be opening an investigation. They've already opened an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. What specifically would they need to look at to determine where exactly this virus came from?
So ideally, what you would do is have an international team actually invited in by China, and it was a cooperative agreement to do that. And what you would want to do is try to get the origin epidemiologically of what happened. Essentially, you do basic epidemiology, figure out where the early spread was occurring, and try to track it back as far back as you could, and to see where the initial cases might have occurred. We talk about this wet market phenomenon, in China. It's very possible that there was spread already occurring in the community at a low level, and somehow you had enough individuals in that area who were infected at a very certain, specific space and time, where suddenly you had lots of cases related to that. And that's often how outbreaks occur, is there's low-level spread initially, and it's not until something really causes enough cases to really trigger us to realize that an outbreak's occurring. But the idea is you get in there, you do an epidemiologic study, you can look at even individuals in the laboratory, whether they have any antibodies to the virus. You look in the community for people with antibodies to the virus, or you look at if you have banked specimens that are there historically before what was known as the outbreak occurred, and then you can actually see if there were people actually exposed in advance. And then obviously what's been done before is you try to study the animal populations to look for that primary host if you can find the original uh, similar virus or some intermediate host that's potentially brought this closer to humans. But it's, clearly bats have numerous circulating coronaviruses, and it's very likely, I agree with my scientific colleagues that this most likely came from a natural source originally, most likely from bats, and potentially mixed within humans or within some intermediate host before it started this rapid spread.
Mark Kortepeter, it is a subject that I'm sure the whole world is wanting to know the answer to right now. We really appreciate your expertise. Thanks for coming on.